Todd Barclay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on the organised crime and anti-corruption legislation. I'd just like to acknowledge the Chair of the Committee, Kanwal Singh Bakshi, and the Minister of Justice, the Honourable Amy Adams, as well as the other members on the committee, particularly those who have spoken already. This was one of two of the first pieces of legislation that I was privileged enough to have worked on the Law and Order Committee. And I've got to say it was certainly a piece of legislation that I think that all parties involved, all representatives across the House, were certainly on the same page around the importance of this legislation. And by and large, we were all on the same page when we were talking to officials and submitters from the various representative agencies on the legislation and the importance of it. Mr Speaker, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of agencies and a couple of the organisations that provided a lot of work and guidance on this, particularly the Ministry of Justice, the Police Association, Privacy Commissioner, Transparency International, for their guidance with regard to the international protocols and sort of experiences around how other countries have adopted and implemented this legislation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the New Zealand Banks Association and the three banks that submitted separately, so ANZ, Westpac and BNZ. Collectively, for those organisations as well as the agencies involved, there was a high level of constructive, productive, pragmatic engagement, and I think everybody at the heart of it wanted the best piece of legislation that could come out. And we've already heard from the Minister and a number of other members tonight around some of the changes that have taken place in response to the concerns that were raised by the various submitters to make the legislation the very best that it can be. We've already heard from Mr Goff the value of money laundering as reported by the departmental report at $1.5 billion. It's a serious aspect of the economy that could provide, obviously, flow-on and dangerous effects to some vulnerable New Zealanders. And while we talk about why this legislation may have taken a little bit longer to progress than what it could have, while we're looking at vulnerable New Zealanders, we've passed other pieces of legislation that have tried to protect them as well, such as White Paper for Vulnerable Children and a number of education amendment bills. So I think we have given this piece of legislation the priority it deserves. One of the advantages potentially of implementing the legislation behind some of the other countries that ratified to the UN Convention is that while we may have been one of the first to sign and one of the last to eventually progress the legislation, it means that we've had the luxury of being able to look at how other countries have articulated the challenges that were raised by as they're progressing the legislation in their respective countries, and we've been able to take those perspectives and craft our own unique legislation which draws on the challenges and inconsistencies that may have been experienced by others. So, I think there is an advantage in that, and it means that New Zealand has truly got a piece of unique legislation, picking the best from other countries who we compare ourselves to, Mr Speaker. Just a couple of points that the Minister's raised, which I think are important, given they probably draws into another reason why it's taken a little bit longer to progress the legislation, is that a number of the aspects and indeed the changes that have been incorporated through the select committee stage are minor and technical, highly technical in nature. And as we've heard from a number of the banks, such as the Banks Association and ANZ and Westpac, the nature of the systems and software that these organisations have, that they already have in place and already provide reporting mechanisms to police, are complex and they are unique, and they do take time to change. And I think as a committee, we did this legislation a lot of justice by taking the time to get a greater understanding of some of those complexities. So Westpac had articulated that they provide banking and insurance and investment services across a broad range of industries to a broad range of clients, and they estimate they've got around 1.4 million customers. And when this legislation does finally progress and the regulations have been implemented, they estimate that they'll be required to report around 2,000 transactions per day. So we've got a duty to be able to make sure that if they're having to do this, that we've got the right frameworks in place from the outset, so that when they spend millions of dollars in developing their software to meet the requirements of Parliament and the regulations that follow, that that money has not been wasted, that they're not having to go back and repeat and redo the software based on changes that we may have to make later on down the track. BNZ's in a similar situation internationally. They expect that across the world they'll have about 5 to 7 million reportable transactions annually. So that they're not small numbers, and given the threshold of payments that are reportable to as low as $1,000, and most of these are electronic transactions, they happen numerous times on a daily basis, and I think that if these organisations are going to be reporting this to police, they need to be able to have some clear understanding of what is actually necessary, and from a police perspective and the collection agency of this legislation, of these transactions, they need to have a clear understanding of what's actually required from the outset, because there will be a hugely costly exercise to ensure that both sides of the spectrum have the necessary software to be able to take on board the transactions that come about. The Minister and other members have also reported that there are, obviously this is a borderless and global environment you're acting upon. I don't think I can remember the last time that I actually gave a cash sum of over probably about $100. So, if you look at most members of this House, we do use our banks to online mechanisms to make payments, and so it's very important. As we've heard from a number of the members tonight, the organised criminal networks, cash, I use cash every now and again. I use an EFTPOS card, a credit card from time to time. I don't use credit cards on undesirable things. I don't use my parliamentary credit card where I shouldn't either. But all the government response to organised crime has been an important aspect of this, and we've heard that the Ministry of Justice and Police have played a huge role. Another aspect that the Banks Association raised, Mr. Speaker, was that they, in their submission to the bill, they felt that it did not adequately identify the form of information reported that should take the proposed method of delivery. So they specifically raised an issue with Section 48B, where they said that the AML-CFT Act requires that the nature of the transaction be reported, but they raised questions as to what kind of analysis needed to be undertaken to make sure that this determination was clear. So that's an example of an aspect within the bill, Mr. Speaker, that was the Ministry of Justice went back and looked at it and took into consideration the views of the Banks Association. Another aspect was the time of implementation. So the bill initially set down that after 12 months following the implementation of the bill, the requirements will come into force, but as we know, the regulations will take a long time following that to implement, and the Ministry of Justice were quite clear that they. No, I'm enjoying this. This Dyson, it's very fascinating. So they've basically said that they'll look at the legislation and they'll implement it as soon as the banks and everybody are in order. But I think Mr. Goff, when he was reflecting on the money laundering, why facilitation payments weren't included, I just wonder what hat he was wearing, whether he was wearing his hat as a member of the Law and Order Select Committee, a former Minister of Justice, or a former Minister of Trade, because if this was such a huge aspect of this bill that absolutely needed to be included, I'm not sure why he didn't feel compelled to pass the legislation himself when he was the Minister of Justice and take a world-leading step, as he said, that we should be here. And so, obviously, as a former Minister of Trade, he will know more than many of us that it's of the utmost importance that we ensure that our businesses aren't disadvantaged on the global scale. We're already disadvantaged by the tyranny of distance. We don't need to be disadvantaged by other aspects that are just a general course of doing business overseas, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Bakshi's has reflected that there were 20 submissions and 11 were heard orally, and particularly within the two aspects of the bill, the money laundering side as one and the organised crime as the other. The themes that were coming through were incredibly consistent, and we're comfortable that we've struck the right positioning of this bill to provide the best legislation for all parties involved and ensure that we're adhering to our obligations under the international treaties that we've ratified, Mr Speaker. So thank you very much, and it's great to be passing this very important legislation and commending it.
Mr Speaker.
David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased also to speak to this bill. It is an interesting bill. It's been around some time. It's had time to mature, clearly. The Greens are supporting it because it does some good things, some necessary things. Time and technology move on. Technological developments create new opportunities for criminal elements to offend and to find ways to extract money in ways they ought not to do. We are, however, in common with our Labor colleagues, we are